Section 4 of the Vedanta Sutras by Badarayana, with a commentary by Shankaracharya, Volume 1, translated by George Thibault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction, Part 4. The fourth pada of the first Adhyaya has to be taken by itself. It is directed specially and avowedly against Shankarya interpretations of Scripture, not only in its earlier part, which discusses isolated passages, but also, as is brought out much more clearly in the Sri Bhashya than by Shankara, in its latter part, which takes a general survey of the entire scriptural evidence for Brahman being the material as well as the operative cause of the world. Deussen thinks that the selection made by the Sutrakara of Vedic passages setting forth the nature of Brahman is not in all cases an altogether happy one. But this reproach rests on the assumption that the passages referred to in the first Adhyaya were chosen for the purpose of throwing light on what Brahman is, and this assumption can hardly be upheld. The Vedanta Sutras, as well as the Podava Mimamsa Sutras, are throughout Mimamsa, that is, critical discussions of such scriptural passages as on a prima facie view admit of different interpretations and therefore necessitate a careful enquiry into their meaning. Here and there we meet with sutras which do not directly involve a discussion of the sense of some particular Vedic passage, but rather make a mere statement on some important point. But those cases are rare, and it would be altogether contrary to the general spirit of the sutras to assume that a whole Adhyaya should be devoted to the task of showing what Brahman is. The latter point is sufficiently determined in the first 5 or 6 Adhikaranas. But after we once know what Brahman is, we are at once confronted by a number of Upanishad passages concerning which it is doubtful whether they refer to Brahman or not. With their discussion, all the remaining Adhikaranas of the first Adhyaya are occupied. That the Vedanta Sutras view it as a particularly important task to controvert the doctrine of the Shankyas is patent, and has also been fully pointed out by Deussen, page 23. The fifth Adhikarana already declares itself against the doctrine that the world has sprung from a non-intelligent principle, the pradhana, and the fourth pada of the first Adhyaya returns to an express polemic against Shankya interpretations of certain Vedic statements. It is therefore perhaps not saying too much if we maintain that the entire first Adhyaya is due to the wish, on the part of the Sutrakara, to guard his own doctrine against Shankya attacks. Whatever the attitude of the other so-called orthodox systems may be towards the Veda, the Shankya system is the only one whose adherents were anxious, and actually attempted, to prove that their views are warranted by scriptural passages. The Shankya tendency thus would be to show that all those Vedic texts, which the Vedantin claims as teaching the existence of Brahman, the intelligent and sole cause of the world, refer either to the pradhana or some product of the pradhana, or else to the Purusha in the Shankya sense, that is, the individual soul. It consequently became the task of the Vedantin to guard the Upanishads against misinterpretations of the kind, and this he did in the first Adhyaya of the Vedanta Sutras, selecting those passages about whose interpretation doubts were, for some reason or other, likely to arise. Some of the passages singled out are certainly obscure, and hence liable to various interpretations. Of others it is less apparent why it was thought requisite to discuss them at length, but this is hardly a matter in which we are entitled to find fault with the Sutrakara, for no modern scholar, either European or Hindu, is, or can possibly be, sufficiently at home on the one hand in the religious and philosophical views which prevailed at the time when the sutras may have been composed, and, on the other hand, in the intricacies of the Mimamsa, to judge with confidence which Vedic passages may give rise to discussions and which not. Second Adhyaya. The first Adhyaya has proved that all the Vedanta texts unanimously teach that there is only one cause of the world, namely Brahman, whose nature is intelligence, and that there exists no scriptural passage which can be used to establish systems opposed to the Vedanta, more especially the Shankya system. The task of the two first padas of the second Adhyaya is to rebut any objections which may be raised against the Vedanta doctrine on purely speculative grounds, apart from scriptural authority, and to show, again on purely speculative grounds, that none of the systems irreconcilable with the Vedanta can be satisfactorily established. Pada 1. Adhikarana 1 refutes the Shankya objection that the exception of the Vedanta system involves the rejection of the Shankya doctrine, which after all constitutes a part of Smriti, and as such has claims on consideration. To accept the Shankya Smriti, the Vedantin replies, would compel us to reject other Smritis, such as the Manu Smriti, which are opposed to the Shankya doctrine. The conflicting claims of Smritis can be settled only on the ground of the Veda, and there can be no doubt that the Veda does not confirm the Shankya Smriti, but rather those Smritis which teach the origination of the world from an intelligent primary cause. Adhikarana 2 extends the same line of argumentation to the Yoga Smriti. Adhikarana 3 shows that Brahman, although of the nature of intelligence, yet may be the cause of the non-intelligent material world, and that it is not contaminated by the qualities of the world when the latter is refunded into Brahman. For ordinary experience teaches us that like does not always spring from like, and that the qualities of affected things, when the latter are refunded into their causes, as when golden ornaments, for instance, are melted and thereby become simple gold again, do not continue to exist in those causes. Here also the argumentation is specially directed against the Shankyas who, in order to account for the materiality and the various imperfections of the world, think it necessary to assume a causal substance participating in the same characteristics. Adhikarana 4 points out that the line of reasoning followed in the preceding Adhikarana is valid also against other theories, such as the atomistic doctrine. The one sutra constituting Adhikarana 5 teaches, according to Shankara, that although the enjoying souls as well as the objects of fruition are in reality nothing but Brahman, and on that account identical, yet the two sets may practically be held apart, just as in ordinary life we hold apart and distinguish as separate individual things the waves, ripples, and foam of the sea, although at the bottom waves, ripples, and foam are all of them identical as being neither more nor less than seawater. The Sri Bhashya gives a totally different interpretation of the sutra, according to which the latter has nothing whatever to do with the eventual non-distinction of enjoying souls and objects to be enjoyed. Translated according to Ramanuja's view, the sutra runs as follows, quote, if non-distinction of the Lord and the individual souls is said to result from the circumstance of the Lord himself becoming an enjoyer, a soul, we refute this objection by instances from everyday experience, end quote. That is to say, if it be maintained that from our doctrine previously expounded, according to which this world springs from the Lord and constitutes his body, it follows that the Lord, as an embodied being, is not essentially different from other souls, and subject to fruition as they are, we reply that the Lord's having a body does not involve his being subject to fruition, not any more than in ordinary life a king, although himself an embodied being, is affected by the experiences of pleasure and pain which his servants have to undergo. The construction which Ramanuja puts on the sutra is not repugnant either to the words of the sutra or to the context in which the latter stands, and that it rests on earlier authority appears from a quotation made by Ramanuja from the Dramira Bhashyakara. Adhikarana 6 treats of the non-difference of the effect from the cause, a Vedanta doctrine which is defended by its adherents against the Vaiseshikas, according to whom the effect is something different from the cause. The divergent views of Shankara and Ramanuja on this important point have been sufficiently illustrated in the general sketch of the two systems. Adhikarana 7 refutes the objection that, from the Vedic passages insisting on the identity of the Lord and the individual soul, it follows that the Lord must be like the individual soul, the cause of evil, and that hence the entire doctrine of an all-powerful and all-wise Lord being the cause of the world has to be rejected. For, the Sutrakira remarks, the creative principle of the world is additional to, that is, other than, the individual soul, the difference of the two being distinctly declared by Scripture. The way in which the three sutras constituting this Adhikarana are treated by Shankara on the one hand and Ramanuja on the other is characteristic. Ramanuja throughout simply follows the words of the sutras, of which Sutra 21 formulates the objection based on such texts as, quote, thou art that, end quote, while Sutra 22 replies that Brahman is different from the soul, since that is expressly declared by Scripture. Shankara, on the other hand, sees himself obliged to add that the difference of the two, plainly maintained in Sutra 22, is not real, but due to the soul's fictitious limiting adjuncts. Adhikarana 8 shows that Brahman, although destitute of material and instruments of action, may yet produce the world, just as gods by their mere power create palaces, animals, and the like, and as milk by itself turns into curds. Adhikarana 9 explains that, according to the express doctrine of Scripture, Brahman does not in its entirety pass over into the world, and, although emitting the world from itself, yet remains one and undivided. This is possible, according to Shankara, because the world is unreal; according to Ramanuja, because the creation is merely the visible and tangible manifestation of what previously existed in Brahman in a subtle imperceptible condition. Adhikarana 10 teaches that Brahman, although destitute of instruments of action, is enabled to create the world by means of the manifold powers which it possesses. Adhikarana 11 assigns the motive of the creation, or, more properly expressed, teaches that Brahman, in creating the world, has no motive in the strict sense of the word, but follows a mere sportive impulse. Adhikarana 12 justifies Brahman from the charges of partiality and cruelty which might be brought against it owing to the inequality of position and fate of the various animate beings, and the universal suffering of the world. Brahman, as a creator and dispenser, acts with a view to the merit and demerit of the individual souls, and has so acted from all eternity. Adhikarana 13 sums up the preceding argumentation by declaring that all the qualities of Brahman, omniscience and so on, are such as to capacitate it for the creation of the world. Pada 2. The task of the second pada is to refute, by arguments independent of Vedic passages, the more important philosophical theories concerning the origin of the world which are opposed to the Vedanta view. The first adhikarana is directed against the Shankyas, whose doctrine had already been touched upon incidentally in several previous places, and aims at proving that a non-intelligent first cause, such as the pradhana of the Shankyas, is unable to create and dispose. The second adhikarana refutes the Vaiseshika tenet that the world originates from atoms set in motion by the adrishta. The third and fourth adhikaranas are directed against various schools of Bodha philosophers. Adhikarana 3 impugns the view of the so-called Sarvastitva Vedans, or Bhayarta Vedans, who maintain the reality of an external as well as an internal world. Adhikarana 4 is directed against the Vijnana Vedans, according to whom ideas are the only reality. The last sutra of this adhikarana is treated by Ramanuja as a separate adhikarana, refuting the view of the Madhyamikas, who teach that everything is void, that is, that nothing whatever is real. Adhikarana 5 is directed against the doctrine of the Jainas. Adhikarana 6 against those philosophical schools which teach that the highest Lord is not the material but only the operative cause of the world. The last adhikarana of the pada refers, according to the unanimous statement of the commentators, to the doctrine of the Bhagavatas or Pancharatras, but Shankara and Ramanuja totally disagree as to the drift of the Sutrakara's opinion regarding that system. According to the former, it is condemned like the systems previously referred to. According to the latter, it is approved of. Sutras 42 and 43, according to both commentators, raise objections against the system. Sutra 42 being directed against the doctrine that from the highest being, called Vasudeva, there is originated Sankarsana, that is, the Jiva, on the ground that thereby those scriptural passages would be contradicted which teach the soul's eternity. And Sutra 43 impugning the doctrine that from Sankarsana there springs Pradyumna, that is, the Manas. The sutra on which the difference of interpretation turns is 44. Literally translated, it runs, quote, or on account of their being, or their being knowledge, and so on, there is non-contradiction of that, end quote. This means, according to Shankara, quote, or if in consequence of the existence of knowledge and so on the part of Sankarsana, etc., they be taken not as soul, mind, etc., but as lords of preeminent knowledge, etc., yet there is non-contradiction of that, namely of the objection raised in Sutra 42 against the Bhagavata doctrine, end quote. According to Ramanuja, on the other hand, the sutra has to be explained as follows, quote, or rather there is non-contradiction of that is, the Pancaratra doctrine, on account of their being knowledge and so on, that is, on account of their being Brahman, end quote. Which means, since Sankarsana and so on are merely forms of manifestation of Brahman, the Pancaratra doctrine, according to which they spring from Brahman, is not contradicted. The form of the sutra makes it difficult for us to decide which of the two interpretations is the right one. It, however, appears to me that the explanations of the Va and of the Tat implied in Ramanuja's comment are more natural than those resulting from Shankara's interpretation. Nor would it be an unnatural proceeding to close the polemical pada with the defense of that doctrine which, in spite of objections, has to be viewed as the true one. Pada 3. The third pada discusses the question whether the different forms of existence which, in their totality, constitute the world have an origin or not. That is, whether they are co-eternal with Brahman or issue from it and are refunded into it at stated intervals. The first 7 Adhikaranas treat of the 5 elementary substances. Adhikarana 1 teaches that the ether is not co-eternal with Brahman but springs from it as its first effect. Adhikarana 2 shows that air springs from ether. Adhikarana 4, 5, 6 that fire springs from air, water from fire, earth from water. Adhikarana 3 explains by way of digression that Brahman, which is not some special entity but quite generally that which is, cannot have originated from anything else. Adhikarana 7 demonstrates that the origination of one element from another is due not to the latter in itself, but to Brahman acting in it. Adhikarana 8 teaches that the reabsorption of the elements into Brahman takes place in the inverse order of their emission. Adhikarana 9 remarks that the indicated order in which the emission and the reabsorption of the elementary substances takes place is not interfered with by the creation and reabsorption of the organs of the soul, that is, the sense organs and the internal organs, manas, for they also are of elemental nature and as such created and retracted together with the elements of which they consist. The remainder of the pada is taken up by a discussion of the nature of the individual soul, the jiva. Adhikarana 10 teaches that expressions such as Devadatta is born, Devadatta has died, strictly apply to the body only, and are transferred to the soul insofar only as it is connected with the body. Adhikarana 11 teaches that the individual soul is, according to scripture, permanent, eternal, and therefore not, like the ether and the other elements, produced from Brahman at the time of creation. This sutra is of course commented on in a very different manner by Shankara on the one hand and Ramanuja on the other. According to the former, the jiva is in reality identical, and as such co-eternal, with Brahman. What originates is merely the soul's connection with its limiting adjuncts, and that connection is moreover illusory. According to Ramanuja, the jiva is indeed an effect of Brahman, but has existed in Brahman from all eternity as an individual being and as a mode, prakara, of Brahman. So indeed have also the material elements, yet there is an important distinction owing to which the elements may be said to originate at the time of creation, while the same cannot be said of the soul. Previously to creation, the material elements exist in a subtle condition in which they possess none of the qualities that later on render them the objects of ordinary experience. Hence, when passing over into the gross state at the time of creation, they may be said to originate. The souls, on the other hand, possess at all times the same essential qualities. That is, they are cognizing agents. Only, whenever a new creation takes place, they associate themselves with bodies, and their intelligence therewith undergoes a certain expansion or development, vikasa, contrasting with the unevolved or contracted state, sankoka, which characterized it during the preceding pralaya. But this change is not a change of essential nature, svaropanyattabhava, and hence we have to distinguish the souls as permanent entities from the material elements which at the time of each creation and reabsorption change their essential characteristics. Adhikarana 12 defines the nature of the individual soul. The sutra declares that the soul is jna. This means, according to Shankara, that intelligence or knowledge does not, as the Vaiseshikas teach, constitute a mere attribute of the soul which in itself is essentially non-intelligent, but is the very essence of the soul. The soul is not a knower, but knowledge, not intelligent, but intelligence. Ramanuja, on the other hand, explains jna by jnatri, that is, knower, knowing agent, and considers this sutra to be directed not only against the Vaiseshikas, but also against those philosophers who, like the Shankyas and the Vedantins of Shankara's school, maintain that the soul is not a knowing agent, but pure Caitanya. The wording of the sutra certainly seems to favor Ramanuja's interpretation. We can hardly imagine that an author definitely holding the views of Shankara should, when propounding the important dogma of the soul's nature, use the term jna, of which the most obvious interpretation, Janatri, not Jnanam. Adhikarana 13 treats the question whether the individual soul is anu, that is, of very minute size, or omnipresent, all-pervading, sarvagata, vyapin. Here, again, we meet with diametrically opposite views. In Shankara's opinion, the Sutras 19 through 38 represent the Purva-paksha view, according to which the jiva is anu, while Sutra 29 formulates the Siddhanta, namely that the jiva, which in reality is all-pervading, is spoken of as anu in some scriptural passages because the qualities of the internal organ, which itself is anu, constitute the essence of the individual soul as long as the latter is implicated in the samsara. According to Ramanuja, on the other hand, the first sutra of the Adhikarana gives utterance to the Siddhanta view, according to which the soul is of minute size. The Sutras 20 through 25 confirm this view and refute objections raised against it, while the Sutras 26 through 29 resume the question already mooted under Sutra 18, namely, in what relation the soul as knowing agent, Janatri, stands to knowledge, Jnana. In order to decide between the conflicting claims of these two interpretations, we must enter into some details. Shankara maintains that Sutras 19 through 28 state and enforce a Purva-paksha view, which is finally refuted in 29. What here strikes us at the outset is the unusual length to which the defense of a mere prima facie view is carried. In no other place the sutras take so much trouble to render plausible what is meant to be rejected in the end, and an unbiased reader will certainly feel inclined to think that in 19 through 28 we have to do not with the preliminary statement of a view finally to be abandoned, but with an elaborate, bona fide attempt to establish and vindicate an essential dogma of the system. Still, it is not altogether impossible that the Purva-paksha should here be treated at greater length than usual, and the decisive point is therefore whether we can, with Shankara, look upon Sutra 29 as embodying a refutation of the Purva-paksha and thus implicitly acknowledging the doctrine that the individual soul is all-pervading. Now I think there can be no doubt that Shankara's interpretation of the sutra is exceedingly forced. Literally translated, and leaving out the non-essential word prajnavat, the sutra runs as follows, quote, "But on account of that quality, or those qualities, or else on account of the quality or qualities of that, being the essence, there is that designation, or the designation of that." This Shankara maintains to mean, quote, "Because the qualities of the body are the essence of the soul in the samsara state, therefore the soul itself is sometimes spoken of as anu." End quote. Now, in the first place, nothing in the context warrants the explanation of the first tat by Bodhi, and, which is more important, in the second place, it is more than doubtful whether on Shankara's own system the qualities of the body, such as pleasure, pain, desire, aversion, etc., can with any propriety be said to constitute the essence of the soul even in the samsara state. The essence of the soul in whatever state, according to Shankara's system, is knowledge or intelligence. Whatever is due to its association with the body is non-essential or, more strictly, unreal, false. There are no similar difficulties in the way of Ramanuja's interpretation of the Adhikarana. He agrees with Shankara in the explanation of Sutras 19 through 35, with this difference that he views them as setting forth not the Purva-paksha, but the Siddhanta. Sutras 26 through 28 also are interpreted in a manner not very different from Shankara's, special stress being laid on the distinction made by Scripture between knowledge as a mere quality and the soul as a knowing agent, the substratum of knowledge. This discussion naturally gives rise to the question how it is that Scripture in some places makes use of the term vijnana when meaning the individual soul. The answer is given in Sutra 29, quote, "The soul is designated as knowledge because it has that quality for its essence," end quote. That is, because knowledge is the essential characteristic quality of the soul, therefore the term knowledge is employed here and there to denote the soul itself. This latter interpretation gives rise to no doubt whatever. It closely follows the wording of the text and does not necessitate any forced supplementation. The tu of the sutra which, according to Shankara, is meant to discard the Purva-paksha, serves on Ramanuja's view to set aside a previously raised objection, an altogether legitimate assumption. End of section 4.